Hey everybody, welcome back. Got another week. We're very excited about this guest. We've got Grace Totman from Capstone. And I'll turn it over to Grace to let you introduce yourself, but we actually got connected off of LinkedIn. And I think we were connected in talking about some of the chaos that was coming to the industry about 6 or 7 months ago. And we hopped on a call. And my first question to her was, are you a real person or are you a bot? Somebody on LinkedIn trying to connect. So Grace, why don't you tell us about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be here. So I work at a firm called Capstone. We're based in Washington, DC. And at our core, I think you could describe us as policy and regulatory consultants, which sounds like a lot of words with very little meaning. But what it means in practice is that we are hired primarily by institutional investors, so private equity funds, hedge funds, and we underwrite policy and regulatory risk for them. And so I think originally when we met, when I sent a random message to you on LinkedIn, we were actually doing the diligence on Sunfire. A private equity sponsor was looking to purchase them. They hired us to basically figure out whether there were major changes coming through in the Medicare Advantage broker space, which looking back on it, there were very major changes coming to the Medicare Advantage broker space. And all of that happened in the middle of that diligence process. That was a really interesting space. But at its core, that is what we do.
Well, you must have done a good job because they got a good valuation and Sunfire's killing it and doing great. So you guys must have done awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And Capstone's global, right? I mean, you're based in DC. I think you guys also have a Houston office, Mumbai, Paris, London.
We do. So we're DC based, and DC is our largest office. London is our second largest office. We've got a good footprint there, but we're growing very rapidly. So Houston, Sacramento, Mumbai, Paris. I think there's plans for additional offices as well. I think we're not just healthcare. I should mention that. Energy is actually our largest team, financial services, tech, telecom, et cetera. But within healthcare, right, U.S. healthcare is so broken that I think our demand has been far easier to find versus some of those other sectors. It's far more global.
Yeah, I would agree. We were talking about that, in fact, at lunch really quick, and we were discussing, those different segments of Capstone. Yeah. And obviously regulatory environment is a theme. It doesn't matter what sector you're in right now. It's very heavy. And we were actually even just talking about hoping to hear something on Chevron doctrine even this week too, right, from the Supreme Court.
Never a dull moment.
Right? That will affect a lot of that.
So, yeah, I was just going to say, so when you were a girl growing up, you wanted to be a regulatory and policy underwriter, huh? Or how did you get into the wild world of Capstone?
No, it's such a good question. So I actually started pre-med. Like I feel like half the people in the kind of broader healthcare ancillary world start. And I took a class called the Economics of Healthcare, and I loved it. It blew my mind. It was about how hospitals get paid and the concept of uncompensated care, right? The fact that in no other industry can you walk into a place and receive a service without paying. But in healthcare, that has to happen. You get into a car accident, you don't have insurance. And so I was fascinated by this entire world and what made it work effectively. And so when I graduated, I started working for a competitor to Capstone in the healthcare space, doing policy and regulatory diligence in the world, and came over to Capstone a few years ago, and fortunate enough to co-lead the group now with an amazing partner, and we're experiencing tremendous growth. So it's been an exciting time.
Yeah, I would imagine just because, like you mentioned, it may not have been your largest segment right now at Capstone, but probably growing so rapidly. I mean, from what we've seen over the last just couple of years from a regulatory and policy environment, I'm sure the need for your services are just exploding at the moment.
And I think what blows my mind is the fact that it hasn't always been a staple in a diligence, right? Anything in the healthcare space, in healthcare, probably second to utilities, the largest payer is the government, right? Whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or the ACA. And the fact that until, recently, I mean, this industry has been around for decades, but I would say that still until recently, the number of healthcare diligences going on out there doing regulatory and policy diligence was still quite a small percentage. That's starting to change, I think, when you have such aggressive policy making, like the commission changes, like some of the MA rate cuts, like the ACA subsidies in the positive direction. It becomes very clear just how quickly things can change in DC. And so it's just really important to underwrite that.
Yeah. Well, and I would even say like we use a reinsurance company and other people do as well. And you'll have different things that you're reinsuring against, and one of them being political risk, and the premiums are so low, but obviously I think that they're not really pricing in some of the things that have happened these last couple of years too.
So what you're saying is lately you've had a lot of job security, and that your team's probably growing, and hopefully you've got some promotions over the past 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, we are growing. Our team will double in size this year, which is pretty remarkable. If we're not the fastest growing team at the firm, we're number 2. So, yeah, good job security.
Yep.
Yeah. So take us through a little bit about what you do, what your team does day to day, like some of the projects that you guys are working on. Like, what does your day to day look like?
Yeah, 100%. So I like to say that half of my job is reading, and half of it is being an investigative journalist, which is sort of how we got introduced, right?
Yep.
When the first thing that we do when we're looking at something like Sunfire, or looking at, we've diligenced a few of the major FMOs in the past, is we just start reading, and we read everything there is to know about an industry. And then we read some more. I mean, we tell our analysts when we're training them that if you don't get to the 5th page of Google search results, you're not doing your job. Mm-hmm. You've got to read everything out there. But then we talk to people, right? So I message you on LinkedIn and talk about how you view the space, and how you view coding and enrollment platforms, and where you see opportunity, where you see there might be issues. And we put it all together into a PowerPoint deck, essentially, that outlines the risks and where they come from. So it's reading, and it's talking to people. I mentioned at the beginning institutional investors, right? So for this conversation, for Sunfire or any of the FMOs, it's usually private equity. But on the hedge fund side, we have so many clients, dozens of clients that are heavily invested in eHealth, GoHealth, SelectQuote, right? The publicly traded distribution players. Right. So we're following and publishing research on all of that as well.
Yep. Fascinating. I mean, I think it's fascinating because, we're in it, but even seeing just the evolution of some of those you mentioned, seeing even GoHealth going from a couple $1 billion to a couple $100 million over these last couple of years.
And back again.
Yeah. I mean, just the yo-yo, it's been kind of going on over these last 3 to 5 years. It's been pretty wild, the roller coaster we've been on. So definitely more due diligence needed than ever before when it comes to political risk. Where do we want to jump into next? Because I gave Grace, maybe 4 or 5. I could do 3 episodes of this podcast. So where do we want to go from here?
Well, one thing I wanted to just say is, number one, thank you. Like, we wanted you to come out here, and, obviously I was super impressed with you. Dan's been super impressed. We met up a couple times and had some high level conversations. And I think that these kind of conversations that happen, behind closed doors, so to say, are what's very interesting for people right now. And I think that for the average insurance agent out there or agency partner, they don't even really know that an entity like yours exists and what the function is. And so I think that it's
or I would also add to it too that we are really digging in anywhere from a couple hours a week to sometimes 30 hours a week, us here at Agent Boost Marketing, talking to folks like yourself, vendors, people behind the scenes, regulators, sometimes somebody from the NAIC, other people from carriers. When agents are like, yeah, what do you do with all your time? I was like, well, let me actually tell you, legitimately, I don't just walk into the podcast studio and shoot a 1-hour episode every week. There's a whole lot more that's been going into it over especially this last year.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of a peek behind the curtain. What I was saying is, having conversations with people like yourself who are very, like you said, an investigative journalist, who have a wealth of knowledge in the industry, because you're out there having these conversations and you're essentially connecting the dots so you can go, make a good representation for your clients. So,
well, and I would add too, you have access to certain individuals that other people do not.
Yep.
To really derive, whether it be your opinion piece or like your recommendations to investor, you actually have the ability to access certain individuals that others don't.
No, I pinch myself daily because the people that we speak to on a daily, weekly basis, just from a net worth perspective, let alone what they are flinging around from a dollars perspective, is pretty shocking. And I tell my team that daily, this is a pretty insane opportunity that you have, especially at your age, right? I'm quite young in my career, and the fact that I can have conversations with individuals who are buying platforms for billions of dollars and have a impact on that valuation and on that decision is pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we can kind of take it from there. I mean, I think what would really interest people, obviously, with what's going on, are maybe talk about
before we go there, you mentioned Sunfire. Maybe give a little bit of,
because we're going to have a Sunfire guest tomorrow.
Yeah, it's funny. Maybe give a little bit of context of how long that diligence process took, kind of what it went into it, maybe what you can reveal about recommendations made, if you could, or any other maybe FMO kind of entities that were related to ours or in the industry. And
does Capstone charge a fee? How does Capstone monetize their services?
Yeah, absolutely. So we get paid in two ways. So for hedge fund clients, they typically pay us on a retainer basis. So for access to our research, access to what we call our client portal events. I was mentioning to you both, we had former HHS Secretary Alex Azar in our offices a few weeks ago. Great example of something that those clients would get access to. On the private equity side, such as for Sunfire, we were paid a flat project fee, effectively. Those projects are anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks. Although, and we can talk about this, processes in recent months have really gotten compressed. And so we've been forced to do a lot more 1 week sprints, 2 week sprints. In the case of Sunfire, we worked on a full kind of 3 to 4 week diligence for a private equity sponsor who was looking to buy the platform, right? And it's not often that we are brought in to diligence something when the largest policy reform in a decade is about to happen. And that rule actually dropped on day 11 of our diligence.
Yeah. Wow.
So it was a really interesting time to be involved. And as you all know, I think the first instinct, and quite frankly, this kind of still exists today, was panic and a lot of confusion. I still don't think we have clarity as to what that rule means. And so trying to figure that out mid-process and come up with, is this detrimental, is this existential to this entire industry, or is it a blip that we're going to get through? It was really just fascinating to be part of that conversation.
And I would add to that, just for reference, I think we were mentioning, so that would have been in November of last year of 2023, because today, like for the record, it is the 25th of June, and so that
24th?
Maybe it is. Well, whatever day it is.
Better than I would.
24th. There we go. It's a blur. But it's been 7 months, to your point, since then. And I would agree that we still don't have a whole lot of clarity from that.
So just a little hot piece of info. Did that rock the boat with the Sunfire deal at all, or did it pause it, or were they just took it in stride and moved on?
So I think it rocked the boat for a few days, but ultimately where we came out, and I think where the industry has come out, is that the FMO space is not going away, right? There's going to be a massive probably distribution of dollars and maybe a rebranding of dollars is what I'll say. But really the concern there was, okay, FMOs are a significant portion of the revenue stream for a platform like Sunfire or for any of the other Q&E guys. Is this going away tomorrow? And I think we got comfortable with saying no.
Absolutely.
Good. Love to hear that.
Well, maybe just because that's been a hot button topic, and I don't want to dwell on it too much because we don't always want to talk about FMO comp and agents.
Call letter again.
But what's the latest buzz around the industry that you're hearing is from carriers as far as if and when and with the lawsuits? What's your latest take?
So I think there's still mass confusion out there. I really do. I think right now it's a big game of chicken. And that's the case in the FMO space, but it's also the case in, the supplemental benefits space. There has been more disruption in this industry in the last 18 months than there has been arguably in the last 18 years, maybe with the exception of the ACA. And so I think everyone's waiting to see who does what, right? And I think the big elephant in the room is United, and whether they are going to differ from what other carriers are doing. I think it's probably safe to say they will. And then whether you see other carriers follow suit or whether you see a real smattering of different FMO comp structures next year. But I don't think we know anything yet. Bids for MA were due June 3rd, but of course, as you guys probably know, the Star Ratings lawsuit completely shook that up. So we now have resubmission as if this year couldn't get any crazier. So one kind of interesting nuance I'm thinking about is typically after bids are submitted, there's this a giant, meeting of the minds, and people talk about where they ended up and what happened. And now you have the opportunity to resubmit. Does that change behavior for whether it's FMO, comp structures, whether it's supplemental benefits? I think it remains to be seen. We'll get clarity this summer and going into October. So a very long way of saying still a tremendous amount of confusion and a giant game of chicken.
Well, I would add to that too, really quick to jump in, that Going back to, though, from what I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, the whole thing was about the Tukey outliers along with the guardrail provision, and they weren't implemented together. So going back to the SCAN, the Elevance, the Zing lawsuits. So from what I understand, CMS came back and said, hey, in order to avoid 26 other lawsuits, we're just going to recalculate the payments. But from what I read, though, the plans actually have to refile and resubmit their bids in order to get those funds, though, correct? It's not just automatic.
So when CMS recalculates, you would have benefited. So there's a hold harmless provision.
Yes.
No one can be harmed by this. If you would have benefited, you get those extra rebate dollars. You have the option to resubmit. It's an option.
By the 28th, right?
By the 28th, yes. Yep. So you don't have to resubmit.
Okay.
And I'd read some articles this weekend, like I said, nerding out on the weekend, reading insurance articles that there were a lot of plans that opted not to refile and rebid. Did you hear that? And
I did. And I think part of that is the amount of work, the amount of actuarial work that goes into a bid creation is tremendous. And if the rebate dollar recalculation that you're getting is enough to move the needle, maybe you consider it. But if it's not, I mean, what are you talking about? Maybe adding back to some of those supplemental benefits that you cut, right? I mean, that's probably best case scenario. We can talk about this at the same time. I think, maybe 3-4 years ago, plans being told, here's a check for more benefits would have been fantastic. But right now, the pressure from their value-based care players to restrict those benefits is tremendous.
Could you go a little deeper on that, on the pressure with the value-based care and the dynamic there?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the past few years, we've seen this proliferation of Medicare Advantage payer and VBC provider contracts, right? So you can think Cano or ChenMed or Oak Street. And in those relationships, typically what happens is that the plan, let's say Humana, for the purposes of an example, transfers 100% of the risk to their downstream entity, ChenMed.
Which is common.
Extremely common, especially in a market like Florida or California or Texas. Where
and it seemed like that was going to be the future model for basically everything.
100%. Right? I mean, from a plan perspective, what's better, right? So they give them 85% of the capitated payment because that's how much you need to spend under the federal government's minimum loss ratio, their MLR. So you give them 85%, and then Humana gets to wash their hands and walk away. And the value-based care player is the one who deals with the utilization uptick, the medical spend, and all of that. Again, plan perspective, nothing better. That's
win-win.
Fantastic arrangement.
But the providers wanted more money, right? They said, hey, we don't like standard fee for service. We want more. And so that was the solution, right? Was let's shift the risk. And
everyone was happy. And I do still think there's opportunity there because I tend to think wherever the payers want to go is where we go. They're very powerful. But what happened is that was all fine and dandy in 2020 when utilization was incredibly low and no one was leaving their house and the plans were touting a $5,000 dental benefit and no one was using it.
Yep.
Right.
And then in 2023, that entire system blew up because the providers had signed up for these contracts that they quite frankly didn't understand.
Yep.
They didn't know that they were the ones taking supplemental benefits risk. And so in the middle of 2023, a lot of these providers start getting calls from their plans saying, hey, you owe us $40 million.
Right.
Say, for what?
Exactly. Right. Well, and that was the thing is during those COVID years, going back to it, it was exacerbated, right? Where so many providers, they were going to die on the vine, so to speak, anyway, if they just stuck with fee for service.
Right.
And you go to people not accessing care, it was like we put a Band-Aid on it because so many people weren't going to the doctor. They weren't able to monetize their services. So they changed it to VBC, where now they're getting those, essentially kind of pre-calculated funds for the most part, whether people come in or don't come in. And now it's creating a whole nother terrible scenario, which I see unfolding in the next 12 to 24 months, right?
I completely agree. I mean, I think right now the VBC provider space, Cano is such a great example, right? They're kind of the what not to do picture right now. And at the same time, because the payers want this dynamic to exist, I think you're going to see a massive dichotomy where you're going to see a lot of providers go under, and then you will see from providers who are, so to speak, the chosen ones, who the payers say, we're going to keep you afloat because we want you around and we want to be able to offload our risk in the future. And so there's going to be some real winners, but some real losers.
So there might be some more C word going on in the industry, consolidation, right? Yeah, I think that's kind of the future, what's going to happen there.
Yeah, I think that's one ugly scenario. Like we talk about it, we've had conversations about it and did today. And that's one that I think we all see, like at least us in this room having a conversation about. And it's surprising to me. I don't know if those discussions are being had yet at the payer level, and that they're all already talking about, well, what's going to be our plan B and our plan C, if and essentially when this kind of starts happening, especially with adequacy and trying to meet all that with your payer arrangements. So
I completely agree. And I think we were talking about this earlier, the irony of all of this, right? Whether it's the broker changes or the V28 risk score reform or just the broader MA cuts, is I don't think that if you had asked the Biden administration whether their goal of all of this was to create more vertical integration, they would have said yes. And yet I do think that's what we see across the board, whether it's in the distribution space, the VBC space, just the MA payer space, frankly, the benefits space. Across the board, it's gotten really tough to survive if you don't have a payer backing you.
Well, since you kind of went there, let's just let's keep going on that topic too, and saying that I think that there's all these 3-letter agencies that are out there, and I'm going to talk about like the DOJ and some of those other entities out there right now. They've been fairly effective of prohibiting or limiting kind of horizontal integration for the last, I would say, couple of decades, right? Like a good, very one in our industry we can talk about is the Aetna Humana deal, right? Yep. It was on the table a few years back that they said, hey, no way, this is just antitrust laws won't clear, creating monopolies and not enough choices. I think that they've been fairly effective about that. But when it comes to the vertical integration and really everything behind the scenes from brokers listening to this podcast, and I feel like sometimes we're talking in a different language, right? But just a hearing aid manufacturer, a transportation vendor, a billing provider, a systems, provider. A
value-based care provider. Yeah.
A value-based care provider, a PBM. I mean, those are under a lot of heat right now. So there's so many other parts of the supply chain that are happening with vertical integration.
A tech stack. A SaaS program.
Yes, yeah. but those are just now really, I think, starting to get the attention of regulators, or very recently, correct?
I think that's spot on. I mean, look at United. They are one of the top employers in the country at this point. They employ a significant percentage of physicians in this country, and that's only physicians. And then we move to the tech stack. I mean, Change, Optum, PBM. Like, United has an entire ecosystem underneath them, and that's largely been allowed to happen under our current antitrust regime with really no one waking up and realizing what had happened. And one of the problems is that our antitrust system is just not set up to block vertical integration. And antitrust is tricky because a lot of it is legal precedent. And so you look at what has happened over the past few decades, and vertical integration has been allowed to happen
not just in healthcare, but in basically every
in
industry.
Right.
Vertical integration is insane.
Exactly. And I don't know, part of me, maybe my favorite conspiracy theory right now is that this is just one way. If you're a progressive Democratic lawmaker and you want Medicare for all, and you have figured out that single payer healthcare is impossible to get, then maybe you allow everyone to go into United Healthcare, Elevance, and let's say Cigna. Let's assume Cigna buys Humana, and you have 3 payers and you regulate them like a utility.
Right. Or at CVS.
That was the quiet part said out loud on the podcast.
But you said it, not me.
Yeah, we didn't say it. Carriers. That was Grace. Boom, that was spot on.
And we do have some conversations with payers, or, the brokers call them carriers, but payers who acknowledge and say, you know what, like right now we're kind of on the outside looking in. And some of them are very much in acknowledgement of that, saying we're not in the driver's seat, so we're having to figure out like what's going to shake out for us.
Yeah, we on the FMO side, like we've talked about, we feel a little victimized as all of a sudden we've been painted somehow as the bad guys or the bad actors in the industry, and I'm like, wait a minute, we brokers have been the connection to smoothing out some of these, the policies and the inefficiencies and the marketing and the communication to the beneficiaries. And now all of a sudden we're over here getting the finger pointed at as if we're some sort of the problem in the industry. And it's been really, really eye-opening to sit and go, why, where's this coming from?
100%. And I think maybe 2 things I'd add. One, maybe the good news, bad news, depending on where you're sitting.
Sure.
is that there has in DC started to become a clear distinction where I think policymakers, regulators on both sides of the aisle are saying, hold on, let's split up this industry for a second and let's talk about United Healthcare and then let's talk about everyone else, because they're two different beasts at this point. So that has started to happen. And then maybe the other thing I'd add, and we were talking about this over lunch, if vertical integration is a new target for regulators and you're getting pressured by the commission changes and you're pressured by risk adjustment changes, what is your exit as an investor in anything in this industry, right? If in the past the hope is we sell it to a payer.
Right.
Or we'll sell it to another private equity fund. And both of those are coming under duress right now. And so for us, more than ever before in the last 12 months, a huge part of our diligence process is thinking about exit strategies. Could you sell to a health system? Could you sell to a payer in a way that's not quite vertical integration, right? Could you sell to another fund that's more middle market that won't raise flags? Does geography matter? And I would say it matters immensely, because depending on the state, you have different private equity ownership laws that are going to come into play. So it's a huge question on the minds of investors right now as they think about the next, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and I would add one thing that you mentioned too and that is to your comments about splitting apart United versus everybody else. And again, for my disclaimers, this is just throwing it out there just for conversation. But if United comes out from this call letter and TPMO compensation, and they actually just make the decision to say, because again, everybody I've talked to have said, listen, CMS, they're not trying to rule on TPMO or FMO commissions. Those are not part of the call letter. So they're really leaving it up to the carriers to interpret how they're going to compensate FMOs as a vendor. Now, if United Healthcare comes out with a very alternative model to say, you know what, we have call center, we have captive agents, we have career, we have more, we don't need FMO services as much as the other guy, and they come out with a very different model, it is then going to create a very different financial incentive model for FMOs with all the other carriers, and that will influence behavior and the entire agent population. And then it pretty much just makes all of the attempts at the CMS call letter for 2025 pretty much worthless, in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. And I think even if you expand that out from the FMO commission conversation, just thinking about broader bid behavior, there's a real concern right now, especially amongst the VBC providers that we talk to, that worry that United is not going to cut benefits. And that if you are a regulator sitting back and saying there's too much fat in the Medicare Advantage industry and these reforms were needed because they'll trim the unnecessary fat, you can then look at United and say, look, the largest Medicare Advantage insurer in the world didn't cut benefits. So clearly we're fine from a reform standpoint. And I think the hope is that what I just mentioned, that now regulators think of it as United Healthcare and everyone else, that should help that, right? And kind of point out that that's even more clear than we thought it was. But there's a huge concern from some of the providers and the investors in the space.
But for people to understand and have a better, more basic understanding as to why that's very different is because United Healthcare, again, going back to vertical integration, every other payer out there, when they have to pay for somebody to create their summary of benefits and their EOC, they have the third party out to a vendor. Whenever they have to go out to market and get a PBM to create their formulary, they have to go to a vendor. Everywhere along the supply chain, so to speak, they're paying and using a vendor, which that vendor is for profit, right? And that vendor is making anywhere from a 5% markup or on fees and services to sometimes 50% or 100%. Depending on what it is. And so for all those other payers having to create products and go to market, they're doing that. And to their credit, though, United Healthcare has done so much in vertical integrations. They're essentially paying themselves, right, with a lot of these vendors throughout the supply chain. And so it really, you talk about how they're able to go to market and have a strategy versus everybody else. And it is not apples to apples. It's apples to oranges, really. So that's the best and easiest way for me to explain it to people.
No, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, and what are you hearing the latest on, some of these lawsuits that are filed, kind of tying up CMS's hands and kind of muddying the waters? Where do you kind of see the up-to-minute update on those?
It's such a good question. So my favorite part of the final rule, if I can nerd out for a second, was I think it was page 5, which shows you how many times I read the rule. where there was a severability clause. And I've never seen that in a rule, at least from CMS in this space. And so CMS effectively told us that they knew there were going to be lawsuits, right? And I think going back to when this first dropped in November, that was our immediate take. This will be litigated, because if you look at the authority that Congress has given CMS in the broker space, it has been exclusively for independent agents and brokers and exclusively for commission. And TPMO is a term that CMS came up with a few years ago and then kept expanding the definition of, right, to where now it includes all agents and brokers and anyone in the space. But the term TPMO, half of the different types of players in the distribution world didn't exist when Congress told CMS what they could and couldn't do in the early 2000s when it comes to broker commissions. And so I do think CMS knows that they went a bit beyond their authority in this rule. That's why they included the severability clause to say if anything in this is struck down, the rest of the rule shall remain. But back to your question, right, we've got two major lawsuits outstanding. We have a Florida-based one led by AmeriLife, and we have a Texas-based one led by Integrity. The Integrity one is far more widespread, so it's pretty far-reaching. And the way I read it, at least, is kind of asking for the judge to strike down the entirety of the TPMO provision of the rule, so effectively the entire broker commission aspect, versus the Florida-based lawsuit is far more specific in its ask, right? And it asks only for it to be clear that the commission structure and the admin fee, that $100 admin fee changes, do not apply to the FMO or the TPMO and only apply to the individual agent or broker. It's tough to say where they go, but I do think that CMS would not have put that severability clause in there if they didn't think that they were testing their legal authority, so to speak. And so that, I think,
the escape hatch.
Right.
Well, and timelines on that. What do you even feel? I mean, you see a lot of court cases move through circuits and eventually progress. What is the timeline you think these things are going to take? And obviously it's going to especially muddy things because, really we're going to be in the selling season here like October 1st. I mean, it's 3 months from now. You're
up against AEP, right? And so I think both of them include some form of injunction ask and asking to get a speedy timeline here. I could be conflating the two. I know that one, I believe it's Texas, the Integrity case, have briefings due within a couple of weeks, right? And so in theory, you could get a decision within a mere days after that, within a month or two. I believe it's Judge O'Connor, though don't quote me on that, could be wrong, who's very favorable to industry, right? So that's quite promising. The Florida-based case, I'm blanking on the timeline there, but I think also quite expedited. So we could, in a matter of weeks, be talking about having favorable decisions in both of those cases that either throw out part of that rule or more likely get appealed and go up to kind of appellate level. And then we get a decision out of that.
Yeah, talk to me if you could, since we're talking lawsuits, and I did not prep you for this one, so my apologies if it's a curveball, but the whole fair harbor or safe harbor, the whole anti-kickback statute, where did that come from and why did it suddenly just rear its ugly head and appear out of nowhere to where they were saying, hey, FMOs, you can't get like a dollar amount per transaction or per sale or per fee because it's against the anti-kickback? Any idea like where that and why it would have just suddenly appeared?
So anti-kickback is having a moment outside of this conversation. There's huge concern about referral patterns right now, just in the broader healthcare industry. And part of it actually comes from what we were just talking about with United Healthcare and Optum. So there have been a series of state-level investigations into anti-kickback as it relates to United effectively referring to their own doctors, right? And that happens across the board. I mean, referral patterns are incredibly common, especially in the VBC space. So I don't have a great answer for you other than AKS is having a moment. And I think it was a convenient addition to the other arguments that are being made.
Right. And you mentioned it. They're the largest employer, I think, of physicians. So if you look at their Optum Care network and, I mean, even close to us, Nevada, Arizona, a lot of these markets where they employ physicians, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you're going to need services from your plan, you might as well get them from yourself, right?
So high level, I mean, because we could go in on compensation all day, but put your prediction machine on. What do you think happens with compensation? And then we'll move on from FMO agent comp. What What's your best guess?
So my best guess is that not a whole lot changes. I think that there will be a handful of carriers that decide to do something funky and lean into internal sales distribution channels. But very realistically, for most payers, that's not an option. So I do think you're going to see continued reliance, quite heavy reliance on FMO channels. I'm really interested to see what happens with the kind of tele-distribution channels, especially because, as you guys know, a lot of these changes were only for independent agents and brokers. And so one loophole is working with a captive agent model, right? With someone like a Select Quote or an eHealth or a GoHealth.
We've talked about renting an agent, being like, oh, okay, fine, I'm a Anthem agent. Oh yeah, you're a United agent. You're just rent an agent. You know what I mean? And it's like you completely circumvent, that.
Which again seems so ironic, right? The whole point of this, counterintuitive.
And then you're making captives, right? Instead of somebody who is unbiased, looking at multiple options for the consumer, which was at the root of a lot of the regulations.
Yeah.
So do you think that in the near future, because we're June 24th and AHIP came out today, which isn't working, but
they can't take payments correctly.
but AHIP's out for 2025.
Yep.
We're so late in the season already comparatively for game planning, war game. The carriers are already late. What do you think happens? Do you think a carrier actually comes out and says, hey, we're not doing anything for this year? Or does it just kind of like drag on till it just materializes that apparently...
Is it even possible that they put in a stay, so to speak, and kind of go, hey, let's stick a pin in it until next year?
I mean, they could do a temporary injunction and say, look, we need to figure this out more. We need to talk through it. The risk with that is the election.
Right.
If you are the Biden administration and you have any thought that you might lose in November, you put an injunction in, then this never goes into effect. Versus if you can get this into effect for the 2025 AEP, the chances of it being walked back if Trump wins in November and comes into office,
impossible.
Almost negative. Because at that point, I'd argue that industry would say, no, please don't make us flip-flop. We just got comfortable with this, right? We can't go backwards. So it's tough.
Yeah.
Well, since we already talked about it, and we're already going to get flagged on this episode anyway,
you already said
and we'll have to manage, we'll have to finagle this podcast anyway. Where do you think the win is in this for the current administration, or how do they possibly see what's going on? Because we've talked about they're going to have an elderly block that gets out and votes and is very motivated. They're going to get annual notices of change in September. There's a lot of chaos going on. How are the Democrats looking at this for Biden coming into the year and going, here's our win here?
I think the win is on fraud, waste, and abuse. The problem is, I think if you go ask the average senior whether they care about fraud, waste, and abuse, or whether they care about their dental benefit, they are going to pick their dental benefit time and time again.
Yes.
So one of the problems is I don't yet think it's clear in DC how impactful these reforms are. We said a giant game of chicken. I feel like that applies to almost everything we're going to talk about today. And I definitely think it applies to the reforms. There is a giant game of chicken where the regulators do not think that benefits are going to be cut materially. And if you don't think benefits are going to be cut materially, then you just got away with the biggest reform in years with no political aversion. I think it only takes one, right? So you go find a woman in South Florida who had a $4,000 dental benefit and a Silver Sneakers membership and everything else, and you make a really eye-catching Super Bowl commercial, essentially, out of her benefits and what happened to them, and then you tie it back to the Biden administration. The problem is we don't have that material yet, right? So we're still waiting. I mean, again, bids were submitted in June. In October, we'll get them. We'll get notice of benefit changes. And then it'll be up to really doing a campaign that kind of talks about and highlights all of that. But right now it is so in the air. It's so, this might happen and this probably will happen, but we don't have an example of this actually happening.
Well, let's be honest. Like we already know with TBC and everything where bids are going to be at. And, again, United's different from everybody else. And so for all the other payers, though, the one thing I keep reminding people of is one of the biggest things of the Biden-Harris administration is they want to expand access to health care to more people. And one of the ironic things, though, is coming this fall is you're going to see a lot of SARs that are happening from Aetna, from from WellCare, from Humana, from these different payers who are going to be doing SARs and doing plan exits.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's not in the major metro areas. A lot of times what people don't understand is for payers to actually continue to expand out into the rurals, it's actually more expensive for them. There's more risk out there. And so usually when they come into a state, they'll start in a metro, and then they slowly start expanding out into the rurals. So we're going to see, again, if I'm wrong, I'll own it, but I think I'm going to be right. And we're going to see a lot of the rural underserved populations getting hit with plan exits and not having choice. And then that's all going to go back to, well, why did this happen? And a lot of it's going to be, well, it's that the reimbursement rate, it's what the payers are receiving, and they can't afford to essentially, we can cut 10% of our membership in all the rurals, keep 90% in the major metro areas, and it pencils out, right? Do you see the same thing happening?
I do. I mean, I think one of the only ways around TBC is to exit, right? To cancel your contract and hopefully you re-enter, but that's an administrative pain from a plan perspective. And so more likely you exit that geography entirely. I think this highlights a very nuanced political support environment for Medicare Advantage. And to kind of walk through listeners a little bit, right? Medicare Advantage is a Republican-born program, and it's been a Republican baby for many, many years. A lot of Democrats historically have called it a privatization of Medicare, right? So you brought in private insurers into something that was supposed to be public insurance. And that has changed in the last, frankly, 2 years. I would say 2 years, but it's more like 6 months, where you have seen Republican lawmakers still very much support the Medicare Advantage program, but now say, well, a tenet of Republican lawmaking is fiscal responsibility. It's very difficult to push for fiscal responsibility when there is as much money as there is in the Medicare Advantage program. And so that support has shifted a little bit. But on the flip side, you've seen Democratic lawmakers who say, well, 70% of my constituents or 60% of my constituents now who are seniors are in Medicare Advantage. And so I have to support the program. And I think what just happened with the Biden administration and all of these reforms is such a good example of how nuanced that is and how difficult I think Democratic lawmakers in particular are finding navigating that world right now, where you do have to support the program, but you don't want to be seen as throwing out this idea that big is bad and private is bad, right? And so I think it's been they're kind of both sides are in between a rock and a hard place because the political support is just shifting.
Well, and it's one of those things where, again, not only are 60% of their constituents in the plans, but they like the plans too.
Love the plans.
Right? So those people who are on Medicare Advantage plans, they very much like them. And it's kind of flip-flopped on the ACA side too, right?
Yeah.
Where as funny as it is, and then you have, talking about, since we're already going to get banned or shadow banned because we said the E word, election and other things, but talking about the ACA, of course, that expansion in the program, Obamacare, whatever, Affordable Care Act, really it's 2014. That's an Obama, initiative, really flagship, piece of legislation from his presidency, right? And so again, the Democrats are very much pushing and hanging their hat on the growth of the ACA space, and you have the Republicans kind of talking about repeal and replace, right? And halting that. So you kind of have these weird dynamics on the Medicare side where the Medicare Advantage was a Republican-born thing, and there's a lot of love and affinity there, maybe not as much from the Democrats, and they're trying to get behind it and grapple with that. And then the exact counter on the ACA side.
I think the other thing too, the win for Medicare Advantage is, analysts will say that Medicare Advantage essentially saved Medicare, the fund, the Medicare fund, and has extended the life of that by, driving costs down, et cetera. And I think what's going to be hard for voters to understand is, hey, somehow, no matter how you slice it, my benefits are getting cut, no matter who's in office, whose fault it is, Republicans, Democrats, my benefits are getting cut. But yet somehow we've got this immigration issue, and we're somehow finding billions and billions of dollars to send overseas to foreign aid and foreign wars. And that's where I think that, it's going to be a hard, we're going to probably start seeing it, like we talked about the debate. You're going to start seeing the football getting kicked back and forth, and the blame game and the finger pointing, and it just sucks because at the end of the day, it's like we just want to be able to help the consumers and explain their choices and be able to make those decisions easy for them. But it's become this political minefield. So.
I completely agree. And we keep saying 2024 is not a healthcare election. But maybe to flesh that out a little bit more, I think if you are the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, you need 2024 to not be a healthcare election. It has not been a winning issue for Republican lawmakers across the board. And if you are in the Biden campaign, you need 2024 to be a healthcare election because it has been a winning campaign topic. So I think that's exactly the push and pull that we're going to see play out on the debate stage, that we're going to see play out on, the ads that are going to start to surface. I don't know about you guys in DC. They've already started. I think that's just where I live. But that is really the push and pull that we're going to start to see. And again, what it comes down to is I completely agree with you. Seniors getting their benefits cut is going to hurt. But can you connect that back to the policy that the Biden administration put in place? Because if you can't connect it back, you don't have a winning argument.
They're just going to think it's part of inflation.
Republicans have always been notoriously bad at messaging out or portraying themselves, as like it'd be easy to say, well, yeah, they got cut because of this, and they're usually the ones that are bad at messaging out on the healthcare side of things for sure. Right. So let's just say you're a carrier. We've got let's leave the compensation thing because I agree with you. I think you're just going to start seeing a couple carriers. Some of the bigger ones are just going to have to get to a point where they have to make a decision because Dan and I always joke this is one of our busiest weeks of moving the needle for our FMO distribution and rallying the troops to get everybody licensed and certified. And they're out there going, hey, buddy, are we getting paid on IOUs or how are we doing this,
Right. I hope we're getting paid to pay all of our staff to onboard more people and show them how to do AHIP and walk them through. We hope we're getting paid for it, checks in the mail.
So somebody's got to flinch. You have some small carriers that are already moving ahead, and I think it's just going to be, like you said, a smattering of things. And I think as soon as one big makes a decision, the others will be prompted to roll their thing out. Agreed. But Dan and I keep joking that we get told we should know something Monday or Friday, Friday or Monday. We've been hearing Friday or Monday from everybody for about 6 months.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
Really.
I'm hearing the same. I mean, I think one or two big payers are going to crack and come out and decide that they want to be the leader here and they want to put their foot in the sand, and then everyone else will have to follow. I think the good news is that despite all of the recent pressure and the cuts and everything, there is still so much innovation happening in the MA space, and there are so many interesting carriers that are entering the market. I mean, you guys had Zing on, talk about an innovative, interesting carrier, and there's dozens of platforms like that are doing really innovative things that I think still very much need to and see the FMO distribution channel as an integral part of their business model.
Yeah, how do you think, too, I was going to ask you, since you were all talking about major payers and this, how do you interpret it with, let's just say, which I can say, United Healthcare, Humana, and CVS or Aetna, their CEOs and legal counsel all actually putting their heads together, so to speak, to figure out how to do that. How does CMS view that, and how is that not collusion, or how is that deemed very differently from antitrust or anything else?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think it's that you can argue that there is some ambiguity, that there is some legal ambiguity. And then if you're getting together for the purposes of figuring out what is legal and what is not, and kind of meeting of the minds, then legally that should be okay. But obviously, that smells and looks and tastes a lot like collusion and can quickly become collusion. So I don't know that CMS knows or cares, but it's a really good question. I mean, if we see the major payers all come out, carriers, with the exact same kind of comp structure and how they're going to do this, maybe it does raise some red flags, but remains to be seen.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, ultimately, Dan and I, we're very optimistic about how we land in all this. Yeah. We think that we love our carrier partners. All of them have good thing. We like competition in the industry. We think it's very good. You mentioned Zing, and we're big fans of Devoted and some of these emerging carriers. And I just think that private competition and competition in the marketplace just makes everybody have to operate better. And I think that when it's functioning properly and the plans are funded, we've seen the Medicare Advantage, ecosystem functioning very well. And I think that we'll get back to that. It's just a matter of, riding through these turbulent times. And because Dan and I have been big fans of the Medicare Advantage model for the past 15, 16, 17 years, and that's apolitical, right? And it's come that way. Like we talked about, it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, or everybody wants good healthcare benefits. Nobody ever wants their benefits cut once they've had them, or their plans to be reduced or to have increased costs. From the compensation thing, what are the biggest challenges that you think the insurance carriers are facing?
Headwinds.
What are the headwinds that you hear from your carrier partners?
So the number one is V28, which, have you guys talked about that with your listeners?
We haven't. If you want to,
the stage is yours.
Sure.
V28.
V28. So it's version 28 of the risk score model, right? And as a quick background here, so when a carrier gets paid for a Medicare Advantage member, there's two primary factors that go into that payment. The first is the benchmark payment, and that is effectively just what the federal government thinks it's going to cost to take care of a senior on Medicare. And it's a per member per month payment. So it's a monthly capitated payment.
And that used to be the zip code base that they gave.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And it's still done on a county level, right? So you get a benchmark payment, and then you multiply that benchmark payment by your risk score. And the design of the risk score is very simple. You should not get paid the same amount for a 65-year-old senior who's very healthy and never goes to the doctor and does not have any chronic conditions as you should for a 85-year-old senior who has 8 different types of comorbidities and diabetes and obesity and everything under the sun.
Do we still call those RAF scores, by the way?
We do.
Okay.
We do, yes. Risk adjustment factor.
Right,
exactly.
Yep. All right.
Exactly. And so the way that you get to that risk score, or that RAF, is through building blocks, right? So you say, okay, you get 0.5 for being a 65-year-old man who is not dual, right? So who's not also on Medicaid. You get 0.3 for having diabetes. You get 0.4 for having vascular disease. You get 0.6 for having obesity with complications. And you add them all up, and you might say, okay, for this member, we'll call him Joe Smith, Humana is going to get paid.
That's a good name.
Add them all up.
Yeah.
2.8, yeah.
1.7 times that benchmark, $1,000 is the average. So Humana is going to get $1,700 a month for Joe Smith because of those risk score factors. And it makes sense, right? You should be rewarding plans who take sicker beneficiaries. We don't want to go back to the days of adverse selection in Medicare Advantage where the enrollment office was on a 3rd floor walk up without an elevator, right? Like that's what we're trying to avoid. Yeah. And the problem is there's been a tremendous amount of gamesmanship in that space. And if you are a United, if you are one of the big carriers, your entire system is set up to maximize that RAF. So you are looking for diagnoses that you can diagnose day one, right? And you're looking for what I will call gray diagnoses. So can you diagnose someone with mild depression, but then it doesn't cost you anything to take care of that mild depression, right?
But you get compensated.
But you get compensated. Right. Can you diagnose someone with obesity, but it doesn't cost you anything to treat that obesity? And so it's created a race to the top for these risk scores. I mean, the average risk score is supposed to be 1. A lot of these value-based care players, a lot of these Medicare Advantage plans, their average risk scores are 1.4, 1.5, 1.6. I mean, it's really pushed the boundaries of this system. And so beginning this year, with the advance notice from last year, CMS did something called V28, known favorably as V28, version 28 of the risk score reform. And so they went through every single diagnosis and said, okay, we've been paying you 0.3 for diabetes. We're now going to pay you 0.17. So that's a 45% cut to anything for diabetes. We've been paying you X for obesity.
Are those exact numbers?
That was exact. Yeah. For diabetes, that was exact. Oof. Right? So think about a benchmark of 1,000.
Are there a lot of people that have diabetes? Yeah,
almost everyone.
How many people are obese?
Yeah. How many seniors have been classified as diabetic? Yeah.
Right. It's well over 50%. Right. So every single carrier right now is getting their risk scores, their capitated payments, what they get paid for having Medicare Advantage members slashed.
But it trickles down from the payer.
It does.
Down to the provider, though, too, who are all in these risk arrangements, too, right? So it trickles down to not only the payer, but also to the provider, right? And then should we talk about even RADV? And can we talk about that, too?
100%.
So going back to risk adjustment and going back through, how many years back can they go with that now? I forget.
With RADV?
Yeah.
Five or six.
Okay, so five or 6 years. I mean, so if you think about it right now, and maybe you can explain further and in more detail, but what the RADV really essentially is they can go back and audit and check the data, right, from the payer, from their payments, right? And so what they used to do, and you'll explain it far better than I can, but they used to go back and perform like an audit, we'll call it like a sample size of a couple hundred or a couple thousand members, and say, hey, provide us with the actual data of these payments, right? Something to that extent.
Exactly.
And then if they're off on those particular, almost like an IRS audit, and let's say you're off on it, then you have to, pay back the government for that audit, right, or that adjustment. But now there's going to be that extrapolation to whatever they find in that audit is going to be applied all the way across to their entire block of business or membership. Is that, you can probably explain it better than I can, but it's just another, talking about headwinds, that's another huge headwind.
No, it's spot on. So everything we just explained with that risk score calculation has been the honor system since risk scores were created. And so effectively you say, hey, I, Humana, am telling you that Joe Smith has diabetes and obesity and vascular disease. And the federal government says, sounds great. Here's a check for $1,700 for Joe Smith. And so RADV, which stands for Risk Adjustment Data Validation, is the audit program that was set up to fact check that and to say, okay, Humana.
We love fact checking.
Okay, like give us the data, right?
There's no way we can promote this podcast, by the way. We're going to get like,
give us the data, right? Go give us all of the medical records that prove that those diagnoses existed. And to your point, that audit system had also been incredibly ineffective because what they would do, and CMS doesn't have the resources to go and audit, 34 million people in Medicare Advantage.
Right.
So what they have been doing up until now is saying, okay, we're going to randomly pick some plans, some contract IDs, and then within that, we're going to randomly select 201 beneficiaries. I don't know why it's not an even 200, but it's 201. And we are going to look and say, okay, we're going to look at all of those medical records. And if we find that you were overpaid by 2%, we're going to ask you to pay that back, 2% on just those 201 beneficiaries. It's limited, right? If you're United or Humana or Elevance or Cigna and you have millions and millions of members in Medicare Advantage and you have to pay back, even if you had to pay back your entire capitated payment. So they found that you were 100% wrong for 201 beneficiaries. We're not talking about big numbers. With this new audit overhaul that they enacted last year, they will still look at 201 beneficiaries, but then they will say, we are going to assume that however much you were wrong on this 201 is how much you were wrong on the rest of your plan. So we're going to extrapolate it out. So if you were wrong by 2% on 201, you're now wrong by 2% on Humana has a contract ID with 2 million members.
Right.
We're going to extrapolate it out. And so the risk.
Or CVS has a PPO plan that's spread across many, many, many states.
Exactly. Exactly. So the risk is tremendous. And it begins in 2025 is when they'll be able to start using this extrapolation methodology.
Yes.
It is, again, you have to be selected, right? So this isn't going to happen across the board. It will be randomly selected, though I think we can probably guess who will be picked.
Yeah.
And they'll go through. And so it's yet another headwind for these payers who are saying, well, wait a minute, we have the V28 cuts that I just mentioned, but we also have to make sure that we are investing in risk adjustment, because if we get this wrong on even one member, with that extrapolation now, one wrong diagnosis of diabetes could mean millions, if not billions, in clawback payments to the federal government.
Yeah, and it's already crazy because if you think about industries and just healthcare in general, just the way that MLRs are set anyway, and you have 85-15, so as the payer, you have that 15% of all those revs where you have to put into your administration, your profitability, everything else.
Agent comp.
And you're rolling year to year to year and looking at your balance sheet and forecasting financials and coming up with bid. And suddenly I'm just looking ahead as a business owner. That's almost just like and suddenly something coming to you and being like, hey, all that revenue, all that profit you've had the last 5 years, give it all back to us, and not really knowing, it's almost like you would constantly be looking over your shoulder. It's a very unsettling environment, in my opinion.
I completely agree. And from an investor standpoint, what we hear from our clients is just how difficult it is to figure out the new normal, right? Because if you got very comfortable with a certain margin profile from 2020 to 2023, that is now viewed as completely unrealistic. And you will never return to that margin profile. And so from, if you're a private equity firm looking to either invest in a payer or a distribution platform or a value-based care provider, trying to figure out that new normal and what you can underwrite is an impossible task because no one knows what that looks like. And we've had, I keep saying perfect storm, but I think it's such a good description of what has happened over the last 18 months in this space, in Medicare Advantage specifically. Just every angle, something is coming at these carriers, right? And so it's really difficult to figure out what that new normal is and what price you should pay for that.
That's true. And to your point, we had a conversation before we started the podcast too about investors, hedge funds and PE, and trying to spend that capital. I mean, they have money that they actually want to place. I don't want to say cash to burn, but they have capital that they're trying to place right now. But you also have this culture and environment right now with the DOJ and CMS and the FTC, all kind of, which people don't know this right now. I think your average agent, broker, they are not aware that there's kind of a task force being launched right now looking into a lot of the PE acquisitions in healthcare and vertical integration right now. And they are signaling to the market that they want some of that activity to slow down. Is that accurate? And some of the states and the AGs are now kind of getting involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this on the state level for years now. And Oregon very famously in 2022 said that all changes in ownership of any healthcare entity in that state have to go through Attorney General approval. That is monumental. I mean, we've never seen that. And from a purely logistics standpoint, to talk through some of our listeners, in a private equity transaction, to have to give the Attorney General 90 days notice throws off your process entirely. When are you notifying? Are you notifying after the first round bid or the second round bid? Are you notifying when you have exclusivity, right? Do you wait until you have exclusivity and you're under letters and then you request Attorney General approval? And then what happens if it gets denied? I mean, it's a huge wrench in that entire process. To your point, there's a number of federal investigations also happening. I tend to think those are more smoke than fire. They're more marketing, big is bad, private equity is bad. They will still be around. There's something to watch, but I think the states is really where you need to be cautious right now because the states have a tremendous amount of power in actually starting to block some of these transactions. And I was joking earlier, I think for the rest of my career, every single diligence project I work on, there will be a work stream about private equity ownership and whether it's a bad thing. From your seat, from listeners from the distribution world, I do tend to think that for now, knock on some wood, it is limited to very pure healthcare provider entities, right? Most of the states, when they define healthcare entity, it's furnishing care in some way, shape, or form. So you're talking about anesthesiology platforms or dermatology platforms. But as you start to see that definition of healthcare entity expand,
right,
that's where there could be some risk for the distribution world where, again, what are you supposed to do if you can't go to a payer, right, because of the vertical integration scrutiny? You can't go to a private equity firm because of the private equity ownership scrutiny. You can't go to a health system because of the horizontal integration scrutiny. And it becomes a really difficult, exit question.
And to bring it full circle back to what we've been talking about with next year and all these providers, which I think are going to continue to go belly up over the next year or two, who are the buyers then? Because then going back to, I don't know if this is what the administration wanted to create, but again, kind of one of the fundamental rules of investing is you should know what you're buying or be familiar with your investment, right? And so again, going back to, well, who's going to be a buyer with these providers and provider groups and IPAs and other people going under? The most likely of them is PE and is payers. Those are the most prime candidates to purchase them. So it kind of all, again, going full circle, it puts us right back to where are we?
Yeah, I'd like to, we're coming ish to the end. Is there any other big headwinds that you see besides V28, besides some of the comp
besides
and
RADV
and filing and RADV
besides the dozen things we've talked about,
and all the other things that they have to implement, and all the changes to the SNPs and all the other things and all the social risk factors for next year,
besides AI,
all that stuff. Is there anything else that's like really hitting your radar that kind of big industry headwinds?
So this is a tiny one, but it's one of my favorites because I think it's going really unnoticed. Beginning next year, the payers will have to send mid-year notifications to all beneficiaries
and all the utilization benefits.
Exactly. Yep. And I think that is fascinating because in the past, the name of the game has been, we're going to offer every benefit under the sun.
Junk
and then
benefits.
We are going to hope that utilization is 1%. And this ruins that entire system, right?
So you won't have a Teddy Ruxpin Papa Pals bear that you can sign up for, or an iPad or pest control or
pet insurance.
Yeah, pet insurance that is some deep benefit that you can talk about and use to sell, but is very underutilized.
Exactly, right? And so from a distribution standpoint, I mean, it's another way to get in front of your beneficiaries, right? It's another touch point. And I'm really curious to see what it does from a churn standpoint, whether we see minimized churn, because you do have another kind of touch point of how to maximize those benefits. But from a payer standpoint, I mean, the benefit space is probably the one undergoing the most significant changes right now, because the entire strategy up until now, I like to say, my favorite metaphor to use is that it's been to throw spaghetti at the wall, right? You have a ton of money, you can offer any benefit you want, so let's throw them all at the wall and see what sticks. And where those benefits live, I mean, half of them live with the product manager and half of them live with sales and marketing, half of them live with the medical director.
Finance, yeah.
Right, it's all over. That has to change. And I do think that is changing right now with the payers and the carriers. They're looking at what benefits they cover and where they sit and what is utilization of those benefits. What can we cut? What should we cut? What do we need to cut? Because if we don't cut it now, then when that mid-year notification goes out, our utilization is going to go from 1% to 50%.
Yep.
And we're going to be in real trouble.
Well, and which one of those things actually provide better outcomes too?
Right.
Candidly, right? So
yeah, I think that'll be okay. And we're going to see a pullback of benefits anyway, so it'll kind of align with some of that stuff going on. Well, maybe to kind of wrap up, despite all this, we're very positive. We're very optimistic about the industry overall. And I know you have plenty of clients out there who are still very much invested in the healthcare industry, wanting to deploy capital, wanting to spend money. Where's the silver lining in all this on your end of things with your clients?
Look, I'm positive too, despite everything we just talked about. I mean, look, I go back to when the ACA happened. People said Medicare Advantage was dead.
Yeah.
Right? There were a couple years of cuts and everyone said it's over. This is the existential crisis we've been waiting for, and it didn't happen. We are in an extreme period of volatility, and the next 2 years are not going to be pretty from a carrier standpoint. But I think at the end of the day, the reason I'm a believer is the popularity of the program. I'm seeing it with my parents right now who are approaching 65 and getting calls and my dad's excited about getting a new bike. It's... You
better get that quick.
Get it before they deny it.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm a believer, right? Because of that. And I think especially if you're an investor in the space right now and you look at either being in the distribution channel or the value-based care provider space or the supplemental benefits space, there are going to be winners that come out of this. There are going to be some losers, but there are going to be some real winners. And if you can just get through this period of volatility, there's a pot of gold on the other side.
Okay, before we really, really wrap, what predictions, do you have any specific predictions about payers that you think are going to come out of this very positively and other payers that you think are going to be the losers, the winners and the losers?
Oh, tough question.
Is it locals, regionals? Is it big nationals? Like I have mine too.
I wrote mine too.
You're also unbiased at Capstone. I have contracts with a lot of these payers, and so I can't really, show all my cards.
That's true. Maybe I'll flip it. Instead of saying winners and losers, I will say who's
going to net grow,
who to watch, and I think it's the scans, the devoteds, the zings who are doing innovative things and who are not beholden to the street in a way where they can't continue to really innovate in the space. So that's who I'm watching. And I think they will continue to be a source of real innovation and creativity with so many of these patient populations that really need it.
Any thoughts about all the blues and all the fragmented? Do you see anything changing there with so many fragmented blues with the national anthems and everything in the next 5 years in the space there?
It's worked for them. I don't know. I mean, I think they've done something really interesting where they've created essentially a national network of individual plans that can be tailored to a geography and to a patient mix. And so I think that's an interesting model, but I don't know if I have a prediction about where it is in 5 years.
All right. Very good. Well, Grace, I want to say we very much appreciate you coming out. Really do. We really value it. We always say we love having people on this podcast smarter than us. So thank you very much.
No, I learned a lot. This has been great. Thank you both.
You're amazing. Appreciate you coming out and sharing your knowledge with us.
Of course.
Thanks so much.